Today, I'm going to show you all the tricks you need to paint black armor with spectacular results. And for this, we'll be using Jim Raynor, one of the new miniatures from Arkham Studios' StarCraft board game. They've done a great job bringing StarCraft to the tabletop, with high-quality plastic miniatures and designs that really capture the essence of the original game. And not just visually, but also in gameplay. It features turn-based mechanics, alternate activations, reserves, and a strong strategic feel true to the saga. Of course, all three classic factions are included: Terran, Zerg, and Protoss. If you're interested, you'll find the link in the description. And now, let's focus on getting the most out of black armor. We begin with the miniature primed using AK's black spray primer. Next, we mix in approximately 40% laser yellow into the black, creating a greenish-gray tone. This mix is applied with the airbrush, diluted with around 50% water. At this stage, our goal is to identify the brightest area on each armor plate. A simple trick is to place the miniature under a desk lamp and follow the natural highlights it creates. You can also focus on surfaces that face upward and slightly forward. These will usually catch the most light. Those areas will define the brightest points of each plate. Bring the airbrush in quite close, so the highlights stay controlled and compact, and we preserve strong, dark shadows. This gives us our first pass of airbrush highlighting. Now we refine it. We add about 30% ice yellow to the previous mix and continue building the light. This step is all about placing smaller highlights inside the ones we already created. We use ice yellow instead of laser yellow to avoid pushing the tone too green, so we maintain the feeling of black armor. Keep the airbrush close and apply soft, controlled passes until the light gradually appears. I usually thin the paint using only water and spray at around 2.5 to 3 bar pressure. If you notice a grainy texture, add a bit more water. If you get spidering, reduce the length of your bursts. At this point, we've quickly established a solid sketch of lights and shadows. Now we switch to the brush. Using the same color from the last highlight, slightly thinned so it flows well without losing coverage, we begin refining the armor. In this step, we highlight every single edge. Alongside edge highlights, we also add small dots and fine lines across midtones and shadow areas. This creates a worn, textured effect and prevents those areas from feeling flat. It also gives the impression that the surface has been worked from the very beginning. Remember, this is metallic armor, so we need strong contrast between light and shadow to sell that effect. Metal surfaces also catch light along their edges, which is why edge highlighting is absolutely essential here. It not only enhances realism, but also improves definition, making each section of the armor clearly readable at a glance. The key is control. Avoid pressing too hard with the brush so your lines stay thin and precise. You can also use small stippling motions along the edges to reinforce the worn look. This is the most time-consuming step, but once it's done, the miniature already starts to look convincing. One more important point when working with black. To preserve the perception of black, your mid-tones and shadows must remain very dark. At the same time, your highlights should be confined to very small areas. This ensures that black remains the dominant visual impression. If the highlights become too wide, the miniature will start to read as gray instead of black. If that happens, don't worry. It's completely normal, and we'll correct it in the next steps. At this stage, the armor looks decent, but we're still far from the final result. Now we apply a very light dry brush using the same color, just to catch the edges and help everything feel more integrated. Think of this step as a refinement, a way to soften and unify the edge highlights we painted by hand. Make sure your brush is well discharged and apply almost no pressure. We don't want to cover anything, just gently blend and integrate in a very subtle way. If you skip the previous step and go straight in with a dry brush, the result will be much weaker. You'll need many more passes to define the edges, and that usually ends up making the armor look dirty. The effect here is subtle, but noticeable. Everything starts to feel more cohesive. Next, we use a reddish gray to establish the base for the silver metal areas. I like doing it this way because in the next step, we'll apply a wash, and this lets us treat both the black armor and the metallic parts together. Apply the color evenly in a base coat dilution, thin enough to flow smoothly, but still with good coverage. Now we move on to a purple wash. I usually dilute it with around 10% water and apply it using a large, well-loaded brush. This wash quickly defines the shadow lines, without dirtying the light areas too much. At the same time, it deepens the shadows and introduces a subtle purple tone that enriches the overall color. This adds more chromatic interest than a simple grayscale approach. Now we return to the previous highlight color and repeat the edge highlighting process, but with a key difference. This time, we don't highlight the entire edge. Instead, we focus on the brightest point and gently pull the stroke toward the shadow. As we approach the shadow area, we avoid a hard stop and instead finish with small dots, creating a soft gradient. We'll repeat this approach each time we lighten the color. This ensures that each successive highlight becomes smaller and more focused. And of course, we continue building texture in the midtones and shadows, using fine dots and marks to enhance that worn, weathered look. This video follows the same style as my Patreon tutorials, so if this format works for you and you'd like more in-depth content, feel free to check it out. You'll find the link in the description. The armor already looks better, but it's still lacking contrast. We take the color we used previously and dilute it to a Type 2 glaze, roughly 70% water. With the brush well discharged, we begin working with very short strokes, focused on the highlights we created earlier with the airbrush. We switch to the brush here to avoid over-lightening the mid-tones and to keep the armor from turning too gray. Start slightly outside the light area, then gently drag the stroke inward, finishing inside the highlight. Because the paint is so diluted, we have full control over the intensity. The more passes we apply, the stronger the light becomes. You could do this step with an airbrush if you're precise enough, but here I want to show you how to achieve the same result using only a brush. At this stage, the armor still doesn't read as black. That's because the mid-tones are too gray, and they occupy too much space. So visually, the whole surface leans toward a greenish gray. Once we correct that, the armor will start to feel truly black. When working with glazes, keep this in mind. With each pass, the paint loses moisture, and the pigment concentration increases. That means every new glaze will cover slightly more than the last. We can use this to our advantage. Start with broader strokes when the glaze is still very transparent, then gradually reduce the working area as the paint becomes more concentrated. This allows us to build intensity in a controlled, progressive way. Now we bring in Quick Gen Night Black to recover the mid-tones and reinforce the shadows. We apply it with the airbrush, diluted with around 30% water, just enough to improve flow. Spray from below and from the sides, so we target only the shadows and lower mid-tones. The goal here is simple: reduce the size of the highlights and deepen the darker areas. This color is a purplish black, so it continues to add subtle variation, keeping the armor visually rich even though it's black. Now the armor already feels darker, but we can push it further. We take the previous highlight color and add about 40% ice yellow. With this lighter tone in a base coat consistency, we repeat the highlighting process. But this time, we reduce the size even more. Start by marking the brightest point on each edge, then gently stretch the light toward the shadow. As before, finish with small dots to soften the transition and avoid harsh lines. Each time we lighten the color, we also reduce the length of the stroke, keeping the highlights smaller and more focused. Earlier we said that for black armor we need large, dark mid-tones and deep shadows. But there's another key trick: push the highlights brighter, but confine them to a very small area. Color is always perceived by comparison, so the brighter your highlights are, the darker everything else will appear. By concentrating those bright highlights into tiny areas, we create the illusion of a much darker surface overall. We continue building the worn texture, but now we shift it closer to the light areas. This creates contrast in the texture itself, darker, subtler marks in the shadows, and brighter, more visible wear near the highlights. We take that same color and dilute it to a Type 2 glaze. Then we continue working the lights, but now in a very small area. The process is exactly the same as before, brush well discharged, and we begin with broader passes, since at this stage the glaze is still very transparent. As we continue, we gradually reduce the working area. What I like to do is apply these first passes across all the highlights, while the paint still has a lot of moisture. This gives it time to settle and build up slightly more coverage. Then I go in for a second round, working the same highlights, but in a smaller, more controlled space. If after that, the gradient still isn't smooth enough, I dilute the paint even further and apply a few more glazes. These are extremely thin, almost like tinted water. They're applied in broader strokes, creating a very subtle patina, softening everything and tying the transitions together. Because they're so diluted, they won't significantly affect the mid-tones. By pushing the highlights this way, we increase the overall contrast, and the armor immediately starts to read as darker. Now we introduce Dragon Blood, diluted to a Type 3 glaze, around 80% water. We use it to work the mid-tones near the shadows. With the brush well discharged, we start the stroke in the mid-tone and gently drag it into the shadow. This deepens both the mid-tones and the shadows themselves. Adding a subtle purple tint to black makes it feel richer, more intense, and visually deeper. And honestly, in my opinion, it just looks better. Next, we take laser yellow and apply the same idea, but this time in the mid-tones close to the light. Think of it as working right at the edge, where the light fades into the mid-tone. This yellow tint boosts the perceived intensity of the light. And since yellow is complementary to purple, it increases the contrast between light and shadow even more. That added contrast really enhances the overall effect, making the non-metallic metal finish feel much more convincing. At this point, the armor is already looking solid, but we can still push it further. We switch to ice yellow in a base coat consistency. Now we mark the points of maximum light on the edges, the areas most exposed to the light, or the ones that naturally draw attention in the main viewing angle. These highlights must stay very small and controlled. This step is all about pushing contrast to the limit and reinforcing the illusion of a metallic surface. If we stop earlier, the armor might not fully read as metal, But by pushing just a bit further, the result becomes much more convincing. As I mentioned before, by pushing these highlights, the mid-tones and shadows will appear darker, reinforcing the perception of black armor. Now we take that same color and dilute it to a Type 2 glaze to finish enhancing the lights. Remember, the brush must be very discharged and we work in a very small area. Also, when working with glazes, avoid applying too much pressure. We're aiming for very soft grazing passes over the surface. At this point, we're almost there. Now we mix these two colors to create a lighter tone and use it to push the maximum highlights. This has to be applied in an extremely small space, and don't overdo it. These highlights need to stand out from everything else. To finish refining, we go back to a Type 2 glaze with that same color. We focus only on the areas we want to be the brightest. And with that, we reach the final result. If you liked it, don't forget to like and follow. I'll also be reading your comments, so feel free to share your thoughts. And with all that said, I'll stop rambling on now, and I'll see you in the next one.